The city streets were alive that evening, glowing under streetlights that buzzed faintly as cars whooshed by. It was the kind of night where people were in a hurry, either heading home or to places unknown, heads down, eyes fixed on their own worries. Amidst the noise and blur, Robert Sinclair, a well-dressed millionaire in his early 50s, walked out of his favorite upscale restaurant. To the world, Robert was a man of success. Sharp suits, polished shoes, and a reputation of being both brilliant in business and distant in life. But tonight, his usual air of calm and composure felt like a mask that had started to slip. The truth was, Robert had been carrying an emptiness for years. Almost 4 years had passed since he lost his only son, Ethan. A tragic accident, a single moment that turned his world upside down. Ethan had been everything to him, his pride and joy. Smart, curious, and always wearing that mischievous grin. The memories were painful, yet he clung to them because that's all he had left. As Robert stepped toward his sleek black car parked on the corner, his hand paused mid-motion as he reached for the door. His gaze froze on something, or someone, across the street. His heart skipped. There, leaning against the wall of a convenience store, stood a teenager. At first glance, he seemed ordinary. A young boy in an old hoodie, ripped jeans, and worn sneakers. His hair was unkempt, his hands stuffed in his pockets as he looked down at the pavement. But it wasn't the boy's clothing or stance that stopped Robert in his tracks. No, it was his face. That face. The teenager looked just like Ethan. Robert blinked, rubbed his eyes, convinced he was imagining things. How could it be? He thought, frozen in place as his heart raced faster than it had in years. Every detail of the boy's profile. The curve of his jaw, the arch of his brow, even the way his lips pressed into a thin line when he thought no one was watching. It was all identical to Ethan. Robert's mind began to spin. His stomach turned with an old pain he hadn't felt in so long. It couldn't be his son. No, Ethan was gone. Buried. This was impossible. But Robert couldn't tear his eyes away. The boy shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as though he felt someone watching him. And then it happened. He turned, face full on. It was like staring into a ghost. Robert's breath hitched, his chest tight. But there was something else. Around the boy's neck hung a small, weathered necklace, a simple pendant that glimmered faintly in the streetlight. Robert's eyes widened, his heart nearly stopped. That necklace. It wasn't just any piece of jewelry, it was Ethan's necklace. The one Robert had given his son for his 16th birthday, custom-made with a small engraving on the back. Ethan never took it off. He wore it on the day he died. Robert felt his knees weaken. No, he whispered under his breath, as if trying to reject what he was seeing. The logical part of his brain screamed that this was all some kind of cruel coincidence, a hallucination born out of grief. But the necklace, that necklace wasn't something any stranger could have. Overcome by the need to know, Robert darted across the street, his polished shoes splashing through puddles on the asphalt. He didn't care about the honking cars or the confused looks from passers-by. The only thing that mattered was reaching the boy. The teen noticed him now, straightening up and glancing nervously at the man speeding toward him. His instinct screamed to run, but something in Robert's face, desperation, anguish, made him freeze in place. When Robert reached him, he stopped just short, breathless. He didn't even know what to say. Up close, the resemblance was even more jarring, and the necklace, worn and scratched but unmistakable, rested right against the boy's chest. Robert's voice cracked as he finally managed to speak. "Where did you get that necklace?" The boy flinched at the intensity of the question. "What? I don't know what you mean," he mumbled, shifting nervously. He tugged at the pendant protectively, as though it were a precious thing he'd always had. Robert's heart pounded, anger and confusion mixing with desperation. "That necklace belonged to my son." His voice trembled, and the words felt alien even as they left his mouth. The teenager stared at him, wide-eyed, like he was trying to figure out whether to believe Robert or flee. It's mine. I've always had it." Robert clenched his fists, emotions swirling too quickly to keep track of. "No, you don't understand. That's impossible." His voice softened, cracking under the weight of his grief. "It's my son's." The boy seemed torn between fear and curiosity, as if Robert's words struck a chord somewhere deep within him. "I don't know what you're talking about, mister," he replied quietly, but his own voice wavered now too. Robert's sharp eyes didn't miss the subtle reaction. Something wasn't adding up. He stepped back slightly, swallowing the lump in his throat as he studied the teen. "Who are you?" he finally asked, his tone gentler this time. The boy hesitated, eyes darting to the side as though trying to find an escape. Finally, he whispered, "I'm nobody." His voice was small, almost broken. But Robert wasn't letting it go. His entire world had tilted on its axis, and he needed answers. He glanced back down at the necklace, now partially hidden under the boy's hoodie. There was only one way to know for sure. "Let me see it," Robert said firmly. "What?" the boy asked, stepping back defensively. "Please," Robert added, his voice pleading now. "Just let me see the back of that necklace." The boy froze for a long moment, searching Robert's face, perhaps looking for signs of deceit. Finally, hesitantly, he reached up and pulled the chain out from under his hoodie. His hands were shaking slightly as he turned the pendant over, revealing the back. Robert felt the air leave his lungs all at once. There it was, the engraving, the one he had chosen for Ethan all those years ago. The small words etched faintly but unmistakably, "Forever my boy. Love, Dad." Robert stumbled backward as his mind screamed for answers. This was no coincidence, no mistake, but how could this teenager have it? And then, as if on instinct, Robert looked back into the boy's eyes. For the first time, the teen didn't try to hide his expression. There was something haunting there, something almost familiar. "Who are you?" Robert whispered again, more to himself than anyone else. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he turned abruptly, sprinting down the sidewalk and disappearing into the night, leaving Robert standing alone, his heart pounding, his mind racing with 1,000 questions, and the necklace's words echoing like a ghost in his ears. "Forever my boy. Love, Dad." Robert stood frozen under the streetlight, staring at the spot where the boy had been just moments ago. The city noise swirled around him, cars honking, people talking, the hum of life carrying on. But for Robert, everything felt distant, muted. That pendant, that engraving, it wasn't possible, yet he had seen it with his own eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he ran them through his graying hair, his breath uneven. "Forever my boy. Love, Dad." The words echoed in his mind like a cruel trick played by the universe. That necklace hadn't just disappeared with Ethan's death, it had been buried with him. Robert had made sure of it. He remembered the funeral too clearly, the way his hands shook as he placed the pendant into his son's casket before they closed it for the last time. So how did that boy have it? Robert turned slowly, his sharp eyes darting down the street where the teenager had vanished. His instincts, honed from years of closing impossible business deals, screamed at him that something didn't add up. Who was that boy? Why did he look so much like Ethan? And most importantly, how did he have Ethan's necklace? The questions chased him as he climbed into his car, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Robert sat there for several minutes, staring blankly at the windshield as his mind raced. Could grief be playing tricks on him? Was it possible he'd imagined the engraving? Maybe the resemblance wasn't as strong as he thought. He hadn't been sleeping well lately, maybe his exhaustion had finally caught up with him. But no, deep down Robert knew what he'd seen. The necklace was real. And the boy wasn't just a figment of his imagination. Robert started the engine, the low hum filling the silence as he pulled away from the curb. But instead of heading home to his sprawling empty house, he found himself driving aimlessly through the city streets, his thoughts too loud to silence. Every corner, every shadow seemed to remind him of Ethan. His bright smile, his laugh that could light up a room, the way he'd always sit beside Robert at the dinner table, asking questions about the world. The memories hurt, but tonight they felt sharper. After a while, Robert ended up at the cemetery. He wasn't even sure how he got there, but suddenly he was standing at the gate, staring down the familiar path that led to Ethan's grave. The cemetery was quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves in the cold wind. The air felt heavy, as if the earth itself carried the weight of all the grief buried within it. Robert walked slowly, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel path. When he reached Ethan's grave, he hesitated, staring down at the headstone. "Ethan Sinclair, beloved son, forever in our hearts." Kneeling down, Robert ran his fingers gently over the engraved letters, his chest tightening. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I saw someone tonight, a boy who looked just like you. He had your necklace. Our necklace." The wind picked up slightly, as though the world itself was listening. Robert's eyes burned, but no tears came. He had spent years holding them back, and now it was as if he couldn't cry anymore, even when he wanted to. "I don't understand," he continued quietly. "How is that possible?" He stayed there for a long time, lost in thought. The cemetery felt colder as the night deepened, but Robert couldn't bring himself to leave. Finally, after what felt like hours, he stood up and turned back toward his car. His mind was made up. He couldn't ignore this, not until he had answers. The next morning, Robert sat in his office, staring at his laptop screen. The city skyline stretched out behind him, but he wasn't paying attention to the view. Instead, he was scrolling through news reports, missing persons databases, anything that might give him a clue about the boy. The resemblance to Ethan wasn't just uncanny, it was unsettling. Could they be related somehow? Robert didn't know much about his extended family. He had always been too focused on his business to care about distant relatives. Maybe there was a cousin or a nephew he didn't know about, but that still didn't explain the necklace. Frustrated, Robert leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His assistant knocked softly on the door, peeking her head in. "Mr. Sinclair, your 10 o'clock meeting is ready." "Cancel it," Robert said sharply, not looking up. "Sir?" "I said cancel it." The assistant hesitated before nodding. "Of course." As the door closed again, Robert let out a deep breath. He knew he was being irrational, canceling meetings, ignoring his work. But he couldn't shake the image of that boy. The way he looked, the necklace, the fear in his eyes when Robert approached him. Robert spent the rest of the day driving through the city, retracing his steps from the night before. He stopped by the convenience store where he'd first seen the boy, asking the clerk if he recognized him. The man shrugged. "Kids come and go all the time," he said. "Sorry, can't help you." Robert kept searching. He walked through parks, bus stops, alleyways, anywhere the boy might have gone. His expensive suit and polished shoes made him stand out in places like this, but he didn't care. All that mattered was finding the truth. By late afternoon, Robert was sitting in his car again, parked near the same convenience store. He watched the people passing by, hoping, praying, that the boy would appear again. He didn't know what he would say if he found him, but he couldn't let it go. Not until he understood how that boy had Ethan's necklace. As the sun began to set, Robert spotted a familiar figure in the distance. His heart jumped. It was the boy. He was walking quickly, his hoodie pulled up over his head as though trying not to be noticed. Robert didn't think. He acted. He got out of the car and crossed the street, his footsteps quick but measured. "Hey," he called out, his voice carrying through the cool evening air. The boy stopped, turning slightly before his eyes widened in recognition. Without a word, he bolted. "Wait," Robert shouted, breaking into a run. He hadn't chased anyone in years, but adrenaline carried him forward. The boy ducked into an alleyway, weaving between dumpsters and old crates. Robert followed, his breaths coming hard and fast as he rounded a corner. The alley was empty. The boy was gone. Robert stopped, hands on his knees, as he tried to catch his breath. His frustration boiled over, and he slammed his fist against the brick wall beside him. "Where are you?" he muttered under his breath. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye near the base of the wall. It was small and shiny, half hidden in the dirt. Robert crouched down, his pulse quickening as he picked it up. It was a small broken chain, one that looked just like the necklace the boy had been wearing. Robert's chest tightened as he examined it. This wasn't over. He would find that boy. He had to. There were too many questions, too many impossible details that didn't make sense. And deep down, no matter how much he tried to deny it, a part of him felt like this was more than just a coincidence. As he stood alone in the fading light of the alley, Robert made a promise to himself. He wouldn't stop until he found the truth. Robert sat in his car again, gripping the broken chain tightly in his hand. The small piece of metal felt heavier than it should, as though it carried with it the weight of everything he didn't understand. His mind spiraled with questions that had no answers yet. Who was that boy? How did he have Ethan's necklace? Where did he disappear to? He leaned back in the driver's seat and stared blankly out the windshield. The city around him had grown darker, the streetlights now flickering to life. Robert's heart still raced from the chase, and a quiet voice in the back of his mind whispered that maybe he was losing it. Maybe this was all grief, all pain bubbling up after years of pretending he was fine. But the necklace was real. And now so was this broken chain. Robert started the car and drove, but this time he wasn't wandering aimlessly. He had a plan. If the boy had disappeared into the alleys, maybe he was staying somewhere nearby. Robert had spent enough years building his empire to know that people always left a trail, no matter how careful they were. He drove slowly through the rougher parts of the city, places he'd only ever seen in passing. The sidewalks were cracked, the buildings worn down and tagged with graffiti. People lingered in doorways, their eyes wary of strangers. Robert didn't blend in here, not with his pressed suit and expensive car. He could feel their stares, but he pushed forward. He wasn't here to impress anyone. Eventually, he parked near an old diner with flickering neon lights and stepped out of the car. The air was cold, biting against his face as he shoved his hands in his pockets and walked down the street. He stopped outside a rundown building that looked like it hadn't been cared for in years. The windows were boarded up, and the front steps were cracked and uneven. A man sat nearby, leaning against the wall with a tattered blanket pulled up around his shoulders. His face was hidden under the brim of an old hat, but his voice rasped as Robert approached. "You look lost, mister." Robert turned to him, studying the man for a moment before speaking. "I'm looking for someone." "A kid, teenage boy. Hooded sweatshirt, dark hair. You seen him?" The man didn't answer right away. He tilted his head slightly, as though considering whether or not to say anything. "Depends," he finally replied. "What's it worth to you?" Robert sighed, pulling his wallet from his pocket. He didn't have the patience to argue. He pulled out a few bills and handed them to the man, whose wrinkled hands snatched them up quickly. "I'd seen him," the man said, tucking the money away. "Kid's been hanging around here for the past few weeks. Doesn't say much. Stays quiet, like he's hiding from something." Robert's heart skipped. "Where is he now?" The man shrugged. "Couldn't tell you. Comes and goes. Sometimes he sleeps in that old shelter down the block. If you're looking for him, try there." Robert nodded, muttering a quick thank you before heading down the street. His steps were quicker now, his pulse picking up again. The shelter was easy to spot, a crumbling brick building with a faded sign over the door. A few people lingered outside, huddled together for warmth. Robert hesitated, glancing at them before stepping inside. The interior was dim, the smell of old wood and mildew hanging heavy in the air. A few rows of cots were lined up against the walls, some occupied, others empty. Robert scanned the room, searching for that familiar face. His breath caught when he spotted a figure curled up on one of the cots in the back corner, a hood pulled up over his head. It was him. Robert moved cautiously, each step feeling heavier than the last. He didn't want to scare the boy, but he couldn't walk away this time. When he was close enough, he cleared his throat softly. "Hey," he said, his voice gentle. The boy stirred, sitting up abruptly. His eyes widened when he saw Robert, and for a split second, it looked like he might run again. "Wait," Robert said quickly, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you. I need to talk." The boy stared at him, his breathing uneven, his hands gripping the edge of the blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He didn't say anything, but he didn't move to run either. Robert took a cautious step closer. "That necklace you were wearing last night, it belonged to my son." His voice cracked slightly, but he kept going. "Where did you get it?" The boy's expression changed. Fear mixed with something else, something Robert couldn't quite place. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, in a voice so quiet it was barely more than a whisper, he said, "I've had it as long as I can remember." Robert frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" "That necklace was buried with my son 4 years ago." The boy's eyes darted down to the floor, his fingers tracing absent patterns on the blanket. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered. I've always had it." Robert's heart pounded as he studied the boy's face. He looked so much like Ethan that it hurt to look at him, but there was something else too. Something about the way he spoke, the way he moved. It felt familiar. "Who are you?" Robert asked again, his voice softer this time. The boy flinched, pulling the hood tighter around his face. "Nobody," he said, the same answer as before. Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair as frustration and sadness mingled inside him. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "That necklace, it's all I have left of my son. And you look just like him. I need to know the truth." The boy didn't respond. He just sat there, shoulders hunched, as though he were trying to disappear into himself. "Please," Robert said after a moment, his voice breaking. "If you know anything, you have to tell me." The boy's eyes flickered up to meet Robert's, and for the first time there was something vulnerable there, something raw and haunted. "I don't know who I am," he whispered. "I don't know where I came from. I have dreams sometimes, about a man who looks like you." Robert felt his stomach drop. His mind spun as he tried to process what the boy had just said. "Dreams?" he asked hoarsely. The boy nodded slowly. "I don't remember much. Just flashes. A house, laughter, and that necklace." He reached into his pocket and pulled it out, the pendant that had haunted Robert since the night before. It glimmered faintly in the dim light, the engraving still visible on the back. Robert took a step closer, his heart racing. "Those dreams? They're memories," he said quietly. "Memories of my son." The boy looked up at him, his expression filled with confusion and fear. "But how could there be?" Robert didn't have an answer. All he knew was that the boy sitting in front of him was more than just a stranger, and somehow, in a way that defied all logic, he was connected to Ethan. The truth was out there, Robert could feel it, but it was buried deep, hidden behind walls that neither he nor the boy could yet see through. And as he stood there, staring at the pendant that should have been buried long ago, Robert made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. Robert couldn't sleep that night. The boy's words played over and over in his head, looping like an endless reel. I don't know who I am. I have dreams about a man who looks like you. The statement had lodged itself deep into his chest, a riddle that refused to let him breathe. He sat alone in his study, staring at the pendant now resting on the table. The faint hum of the city outside felt distant, muted by the whirlwind of thoughts consuming him. That necklace had been buried with Ethan. There was no question about that. Robert had been there. He had watched the casket lower into the ground, the cold earth swallowing every last piece of his son. And yet, here it was. Real, tangible, held in the hands of a boy who shouldn't have it. A boy who had Ethan's face, Ethan's eyes. Robert's hands shook as he picked up the pendant again, running his thumb over the engraving on the back. Forever my little boy. He'd had it custom made when Ethan turned 10, after his son had insisted on wearing something just like Dad. It was more than an accessory. It had been a piece of Robert's heart, passed down to the one person in the world who mattered most. But now it no longer made sense. Nothing did. The next morning, Robert was back at the shelter before the sun rose. He didn't want to risk the boy disappearing again. This time, he was prepared. He had cash, food, and clothing. Anything to make the boy stay long enough to talk. The shelter was quieter now, most of the cots empty as people scattered for the day. Robert searched the room anxiously, his chest tightening with every empty corner he found. Then he spotted him. The boy sat alone on the floor near one of the windows, knees pulled up to his chest, staring blankly outside. The hood was down this time, revealing his face more clearly in the pale morning light. Robert's breath caught again. The resemblance was undeniable, so much so that it felt like looking at a ghost. He approached slowly, careful not to startle him. "Hey," Robert said softly. The boy turned, his eyes wary but no longer filled with the same panic Robert had seen the night before. He didn't run this time. Instead, he watched Robert carefully, as though trying to decide whether to trust him. "I brought you something," Robert said, crouching down and pulling a brown paper bag from his side. "It's just breakfast. You look like you haven't eaten much." The boy didn't respond, but his gaze flickered to the bag. Robert set it down next to him and waited. After a few long moments, the boy slowly reached for it, opening it to find a sandwich and an orange. He ate quietly, his movements cautious, as though he expected the food to disappear if he didn't act fast enough. Robert sat beside him, leaving a careful distance so the boy wouldn't feel cornered. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The boy swallowed a bite of his sandwich and looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nate." Robert nodded, repeating the name in his head. Nate. It felt strange to call him anything other than Ethan, but he forced himself to focus. "Nate," he said carefully, "I need you to help me understand something. That necklace, it belonged to my son. He died 4 years ago, and you look exactly like him. How is that possible?" Nate's fingers tightened around the sandwich, his shoulders tensing. "I don't know," he muttered. "I told you, I've always had it. I don't remember where it came from. I don't remember anything about before." Robert frowned, confusion twisting in his gut. "Before?" Nate nodded slightly, still avoiding Robert's gaze. "Before I woke up. Here, I don't know how old I was. Maybe 10, maybe 11. I was in a hospital. They said I'd been found unconscious, no ID, no name. They told me I must have been in an accident, but I didn't remember anything. Not my family, not my home. Nothing." Robert listened in stunned silence, his mind racing. A hospital. An accident. He gripped the edge of his knee, trying to stay calm. "And they never figured out who you were." Nate shook his head. "They tried, but nobody came looking for me. Eventually, I ended up in foster care. I bounced around a lot after that. Never stayed anywhere too long." His voice grew quieter, more distant. "I don't think they wanted me around." The words cut through Robert like a blade. He couldn't imagine anyone abandoning Ethan, leaving him alone and forgotten. But now, looking at Nate, this boy who was so clearly carrying a lifetime of loneliness, Robert felt an ache deep in his chest. "What about the necklace?" Robert pressed gently. "Did you have it when they found you?" Nate paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "I don't remember," he admitted. "But I think so. I had it when I woke up. I've always had it." Robert stared at him, his thoughts a tangled mess. How could this be possible? How could a boy who looked exactly like Ethan appear out of nowhere, wearing the very thing that had been buried with his son? It didn't add up, and yet everything in Robert's gut told him this was real. "Do you have any scars?" Robert asked suddenly, his voice hesitant. "Anything unusual?" Nate's expression darkened. He hesitated, as though debating whether to say anything. Then, wordlessly, he pulled up the sleeve of his worn sweatshirt, revealing a faint, jagged scar running along his forearm. Robert felt his blood turn cold. He knew that scar. Ethan had gotten it when he was 8, after falling out of a tree in their backyard. Robert couldn't breathe. He stared at the scar, at Nate, his mind screaming that this wasn't possible. And yet, there it was. The scar, the pendant, the face. It all pointed to one impossible truth. Nate pulled his sleeve back down, shifting uncomfortably. "What's wrong?" he asked quietly. Robert shook his head, trying to find the words. "That scar," he whispered. "My son, Ethan, he had that same scar." Nate froze. The color drained from his face as he stared at Robert, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What are you saying?" Robert didn't answer. He couldn't. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they didn't form an image he could understand. It was as though reality itself had twisted, bending the past and present together in a way that defied all logic. The room felt unbearably still as Robert and Nate stared at each other, both of them trapped in the weight of what they didn't understand. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice hoarse. "Nate, I think you might be my son." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Nate's face paled, his breathing growing uneven. "That's not possible," he whispered. "I know it sounds crazy," Robert said quickly, leaning forward, "but everything points to it. The necklace, the scar, your face. I don't know how, but you are Ethan." Nate shook his head violently, backing away as though the words themselves were too much to bear. "Stop it," he shouted. "I'm not him. I'm not." "Nate, listen to me." "No." Nate bolted to his feet, his eyes wild with fear. Before Robert could stop him, the boy ran toward the door, disappearing into the street outside. Robert stood frozen, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. Everything he'd just said, everything he'd seen, it couldn't be real. And yet he couldn't deny it anymore. The truth was staring him in the face, terrifying and impossible. Somehow his son was alive, and now he was gone again.